Ladies and gentlemen, when someone comes at you with aggression, with raised voice and angry words, their goal is dominance, plain and simple. They're trying to throw you off balance. But here's the truth: they don't understand strength isn't loud. Real strength, enduring, intelligent, commanding strength, is often quiet. It doesn't panic. It doesn't shout. It doesn't match energy. It controls it. The first thing you need to understand is this: you win the moment you stay calm. When they raise their voice, you lower yours. When they talk fast, you speak slow, not because you're weak, but because you're centered. You refuse to give your power away to emotional chaos. That calmness isn't passive, it's deliberate. It forces the aggressor to realize they're reacting wildly while you're choosing your words with surgical precision. That alone can flip the dynamic instantly. Then you mirror their words back to them, not sarcastically, but precisely. If they say, "You're so irresponsible," you calmly repeat, "You believe I'm irresponsible." Suddenly they hear it outside their own head. This makes them reflect. Most aggression is subconscious. It's a release of frustration. But when you hold a mirror to it, you introduce consciousness, and consciousness corrects. The third trick is a question, but not just any question. A disarming question. You look them in the eye and ask, "What are you really trying to say?" Or do you actually believe that tone is helping your point? You're not provoking, you're redirecting. And it works, because questions demand mental work. You interrupt their rhythm, you bring logic into a moment ruled by emotion. But perhaps the most important verbal move is this: label the behavior, not the person. You don't say, "You're disrespectful." You say, "That comment came across as disrespectful." See the difference. One attacks the identity, the other calls out the conduct. Why is that powerful? Because most people, even angry ones, want to see themselves as decent. You don't back them into a corner. You give them a path to self-correct without ego collapse. Sometimes, the most effective language isn't language at all, it's silence. A pause after they've just said something nasty, and you say nothing, no reaction. You just look at them. That silence is heavy, it's uncomfortable. And in that tension, they feel the weight of their words. Silence, when used right, becomes the loudest thing in the room. And finally, when none of that works, and sometimes it won't, you walk. But you walk with dignity. You don't storm out, you don't slam doors. You say, "I'm not continuing this conversation in this tone." That's it. You've reclaimed control, you've drawn a boundary, you've taught a lesson without saying one cruel word. That, my friend, is what real power looks like. Because this isn't just about winning arguments. It's about protecting your peace without sacrificing your integrity. It's about mastering verbal self-defense in a world that rewards shouting over sense. And when you carry yourself with calm strength, when you use language as a shield instead of a weapon, you don't just survive the aggression, you transform it. You force the other person to confront their own behavior. And often, not always, but often, that confrontation leads to one thing, not because you shamed them, but because you didn't stoop to their level. You showed them what it looks like to lead with intelligence, control, and emotional power. That's how you make an aggressive person sorry, not by breaking them down, but by raising the standard of the conversation so high they feel small in their own behavior. When someone speaks aggressively, the natural human reaction is to either mirror that aggression or shrink under it. But if you do either, you're no longer in control of the situation. They are. The first and most powerful verbal tactic you can use isn't a fancy phrase or a clever comeback. It's something simpler, deeper, and far more effective. Remain calm and speak slowly. In the face of someone raising their voice, throwing sharp words, or trying to dominate the room, slowing your tone and pace is a psychological shift that flips the power structure. You're telling them, without saying it, that you are not afraid, you are not reactive, and you are not moving to their rhythm. Speaking slowly forces both you and the other person to engage differently. You're giving yourself time to choose your words with precision, and more importantly, you're refusing to let adrenaline govern your response. Most aggressive people feed off emotional reaction. When you don't give it to them, it disrupts their flow. It's like pulling the battery out of a machine mid-operation. Aggression thrives on fuel. Calmness cuts the supply. But this isn't about pretending to be calm. It's about learning to actually control your nervous system under pressure. You breathe deeper. You lower your voice. You say less, but each word carries more weight. You're not rushing to defend yourself. You're asserting that you don't need to rush. That confidence, unshaken, slow, deliberate, sends a signal: I am not intimidated, and I'm not going to fight your fire with more fire. I'm going to suffocate it with clarity. Psychologically, people mirror what they experience. If you meet speed with stillness, heat with coolness, noise with silence, most people begin to adjust. Not always out of choice, often out of discomfort. Your calmness becomes a mirror, and suddenly their behavior looks exaggerated, childish, and irrational. And that moment, when they hear the contrast between your grounded voice and their own agitation, is the first crack in their armor. Another subtle impact of speaking slowly is that it commands attention. It demands that every word you speak be heard clearly. You are not babbling to win, you're stating to lead. You are planting each word with intentional weight, and whether they realize it or not, it makes the other person listen. And sometimes what you don't say, the pauses, the silence between sentences, becomes the sharpest message of all. This technique works across situations in the boardroom, in relationships, in conflict with strangers, even online. It's a universal truth. The person who controls the tone controls the room, and tone is not volume. Tone is intention. It's presence. It's being so deeply anchored in your values, your clarity, and your emotional regulation that another person's chaos doesn't pull you out of alignment. That is rare, and that is powerful. People don't remember every word you say in conflict, but they do remember how you made them feel. And when someone is acting out, trying to provoke, and you respond with clarity, stability, and poise, it leaves an impression they can't shake. Often, later, when they've calmed down, that memory lingers. It invites reflection. It triggers regret because they realize they were loud, but you were strong. They lost control. You never did. So the next time you're faced with someone aggressive, don't match them, run. Don't react. Slow down. Speak slower than usual. Lower your voice slightly. Hold eye contact. Let each word land like a stone, not a spray of bullets. You're not trying to overpower. You're trying to anchor. And when you do, you don't just win the moment. You influence it. You become the calm in the storm. And that, more than anything, forces people to see themselves and feel sorry for how they showed up. When dealing with an aggressive person, one of the most effective tools you can use is the art of mirroring their words back to them. Not to mock or provoke, but to reflect. Most people don't actually hear themselves when they're angry. Their words fly out, fueled by emotion, unfiltered and unexamined. But when you, in a calm and controlled manner, repeat their words back, you create a psychological mirror that forces them to confront their own tone and language. It's subtle but powerful. You are not reacting, you're reflecting. And reflection is where self-awareness begins. Let's say someone says to you, "You're completely useless at this." Instead of firing back or shutting down, you calmly say, "You think I'm completely useless at this?" That simple reflection pauses the moment. It disrupts the emotional rhythm they were riding. Now, instead of continuing their tirade, they're forced to think. They hear it out loud again, not from their mouth, but yours, and that changes everything. The words that sounded justified in the heat of their emotion now sound cruel, exaggerated, or inappropriate when spoken with clarity. The brilliance of mirroring lies in its neutrality. You're not adding anything. You're not escalating the situation. You're simply putting the weight of their own words back in their hands. This strategy works because it bypasses the instinctual fight or flight reaction and replaces it with a psychological invitation. Here's what you said. Are you sure that's how you want to sound? Without saying it outright, you're encouraging them to examine their behavior, often triggering internal discomfort or even regret. Another layer of this approach is how it helps you stay in control. When you repeat their words, you're giving yourself a buffer, a moment to breathe, to think, to stay grounded. You're not scrambling for a comeback or letting their emotion drag you into chaos. You're slowing the exchange down. You're anchoring the conversation in clarity, not rage. This shift changes the entire dynamic. You take away their perceived dominance because now you are leading the tone and pace of the interaction. This verbal reflection technique can be used in both professional and personal contexts. In a workplace, when someone accuses you harshly, for example, "You always mess things up," you can say, "You feel I always mess things up." It's not sarcastic, it's centered. And often, that will prompt a correction. Well, not always, but. And just like that, the aggression starts to dissolve. The exaggerated claim shrinks under the weight of logic and accountability. They start walking themselves back. In relationships, this can diffuse even emotionally charged conversations. When someone says, "You never care about how I feel," and you calmly reply, "You feel I never care about how you feel," it turns the conflict into a conversation. It signals that you're listening, but also asking them to clarify and reflect. Now, they're less likely to double down on blame and more likely to explain, soften, or even apologize. The goal is not to embarrass or dominate them. It's to create space for self-awareness. People don't change when you yell back. They change when they see themselves clearly. And mirroring their own words in your calm, steady voice gives them that mirror. It's nonviolent. It's disarming. And most of all, it's effective. You don't have to fight fire with fire. Sometimes holding up a mirror is all it takes to extinguish the flames. Asserting control over a conversation with an aggressive person requires more than just response. It requires awareness. One of the most powerful tools to regain control without resorting to aggression is the use of disarming questions. Questions, when strategically crafted, are not only tools for gathering information but weapons for shifting the power dynamic in your favor. By asking a simple but sharp question, you subtly disrupt the emotional flow of the person who is aggressively attacking. Their initial instinct is to react emotionally, but a well-placed question forces them to pause and think. You're no longer playing by their rules. You're forcing them to confront the very essence of their behavior. Consider this scenario: someone is yelling at you about something trivial, maybe blaming you for an error you didn't even commit. Instead of defending yourself, you calmly ask, "What's really bothering you here?" This question does several things. First, it disorients them. They weren't expecting a reflective question. They were expecting a defensive or reactive answer. Second, it shifts the conversation away from blame and into the realm of understanding. Aggressive people often lash out due to underlying frustrations or insecurities. By asking a question, you indirectly invite them to confront those deeper feelings rather than remain on the surface of immediate anger. Another key aspect of using disarming questions is that they force the other person to articulate their emotions in a more coherent manner. When someone is shouting, their words are often a jumbled mess of frustration. By asking a clear, neutral question, something like, "What outcome are you hoping for right now?" or "Do you think this is helping us resolve the situation?" you put them in a position where they have to slow down and clarify their emotional state. You are no longer a target of their aggression. You are instead a facilitator of reflection, and reflection is what leads to growth and self-awareness. Questions also help take the power out of their hands. Aggressive people are often trying to control the conversation by dominating it, shouting, or escalating the situation. But when you take a step back and ask a question, you immediately regain that control. Now, you're not simply reacting to their anger, you're forcing them to engage in a more thoughtful, reflective way. You introduce rationality into a situation that was previously fueled by emotion. In a sense, you're teaching them how to communicate more constructively by modeling the very behavior they're lacking. Disarming questions are particularly powerful in situations of conflict because they redirect the focus. Instead of focusing on who's right or wrong, the conversation becomes one of problem solving. What do you need from me to make this better? That question forces the aggressor to stop seeing you as the enemy and starts framing you as an ally in finding a solution. Even in the most heated of arguments, asking questions invites collaboration rather than conflict. It invites peace instead of war. What's essential here is the delivery of the question. It must be calm, composed, and without any hint of sarcasm or judgment. The power of this strategy lies in the neutrality of the inquiry. It's not about throwing their words back at them. It's about introducing a sense of calm, respect, and mutual understanding into the conversation. Even the most aggressive person can't help but feel the subtle shift in the dynamic when their anger meets a thoughtful, composed response. In the end, asking disarming questions doesn't just change the tone of the conversation, it forces the other person to introspect, to question themselves. And when people question themselves, they begin to realize their own faults. That's when they start to soften. That's when they start to apologize, or at the very least, when they begin to hear the absurdity in their own aggression. Asking questions doesn't make you weak or passive. It makes you the person in control of the situation. It gives you the power to reshape the conversation and guide it to a place of resolution, even when the person across from you is not interested in compromise. It's not about getting them to say they're sorry immediately, but about opening the door to that possibility by leading the conversation with intelligence, empathy, and clarity. In the face of aggression, many people instinctively try to defend themselves by justifying their actions, explaining their intentions, or counterattacking. But this approach often adds more fuel to the fire. One of the most overlooked, yet profoundly powerful verbal strategies in such situations is the simple act of agreeing, carefully and selectively, with the aggressive person's emotional experience. Not with their behavior, not with their accusations, but with the fact that they are upset. This subtle but potent move immediately disarms much of their hostility because it addresses the emotional core of their outburst rather than the surface-level attack. When someone is aggressive toward you, what they often want more than anything is to feel heard. They may not even realize it consciously, but the emotional energy behind their words demands recognition. When you calmly respond with something like, "I can see that you're really frustrated," or It sounds like this situation has been very upsetting for you. You are acknowledging their emotional reality. You are telling them without using these words, I see you, I hear you. And for many people, that acknowledgement alone is enough to start softening their stance. Agreeing with the emotion behind aggression doesn't mean you agree with their conclusions or accusations. It doesn't mean you accept blame if it's unwarranted. What it means is that you recognize that from their perspective, their emotional reaction makes sense to them, and you are willing to meet them on that basic human level. This is an act of psychological generosity. It says, your feelings matter enough that I am not going to fight them. I am going to honor that you're experiencing something intense. When you respond to aggression with acknowledgement, you take the wind out of the aggressor's sails. They expected resistance. They expected denial. They expected a fight. What they didn't expect was understanding. And when aggression meets understanding, something profound happens. The aggressive person is often caught off guard by their own behavior. They suddenly see themselves, sometimes for the first time, as being out of proportion, as being emotional, as being unfair. It triggers a pause in their pattern. This strategy also gives you a tremendous amount of control. Rather than being reactive, you are choosing to steer the emotional energy of the encounter. You are setting the emotional tone and inviting, without demanding, a more constructive interaction. By validating their feelings, you create a psychological opening for them to reflect and possibly adjust their behavior. It doesn't always happen instantly, but it plants a seed of self-awareness that can later grow into an apology, or at least a shift in attitude. Using this tactic wisely requires emotional intelligence. You must remain sincere and composed. If your acknowledgement sounds sarcastic or forced, it will backfire. The power lies in genuine, calm recognition. You're not saying, you're right to yell at me. You're saying, I understand you're upset. These are two very different messages, and it's crucial to maintain that distinction in your mind and your tone. In tense situations, you might also combine this approach with clarifying questions. After acknowledging their feelings, you can ask, what can we do to move forward from here? Or how would you like to see this resolved? By doing this, you redirect the emotional energy toward problem solving, offering the aggressive person a pathway out of their anger without making them feel like they lost the battle. People hate to feel defeated, especially when they are already emotional. Giving them a dignified exit from their aggression is often the most graceful and effective way to resolve conflict. Ultimately, agreeing with the emotional experience of an aggressive person isn't about surrendering. It's about leading, quietly, firmly, and intelligently. It's about understanding that humans are emotional creatures, and that often the most powerful thing you can do in a storm is not to build a bigger wall, but to step into the rain with open arms and say, I see you. And in that moment, the storm often loses its power because it was never about the rain. It was always about the need to be seen. Silence is often underestimated in conversations, especially when dealing with aggression. We are conditioned to think that we must fill every moment with words, that silence somehow signals weakness, confusion, or surrender. But silence, when used intentionally, is one of the most powerful tools you can deploy against an aggressive person. When someone is attacking verbally, they are often fueled by momentum. The more they talk, the more energized and justified they feel. If you meet that energy with more words, even defensive ones, you are helping to sustain their aggression. But if you withdraw from that rhythm, if you simply remain calm and silent, you create a powerful vacuum. Aggressive individuals thrive on reactions. When there is no reaction, when their words fall into a deep silence instead of sparking a fight, they are forced to face their own behavior without the distraction of a contest. Using silence does not mean shutting down emotionally or mentally. It means staying very present, very aware, and choosing not to engage with chaos. When someone is trying to provoke you, your silence is not an absence, it is a strong presence. It says, without saying, I will not dignify this behavior with my energy. And that can be more unsettling to an aggressor than any clever comeback or logical argument. Silence can be deeply uncomfortable for people who are looking for a fight, because it denies them the very thing they crave most: validation of their emotional escalation. Imagine someone yelling at you across a conference table, throwing accusations, maybe even insults. You could try to argue back, defend yourself point by point, but that would only make you look like an equal participant in the drama. Instead, imagine sitting back, keeping your posture strong and open, making calm eye contact if appropriate, and saying absolutely nothing. You breathe, you stay centered, you let them feel the full weight of their own words. The longer the silence stretches, the more the aggressor has to deal with the uncomfortable realization that they are performing alone. That realization often leads to self-consciousness, and self-consciousness leads to a decrease in aggressive behavior. Strategic silence also gives you time. It allows you to assess the situation clearly without being swept away by emotional currents. It gives you the space to think, to plan your next move carefully. In contrast, quick verbal reactions often come from a place of defensiveness or emotional upset. Silence allows you to respond from a place of control and deliberate choice. Maybe after a long pause, you choose to speak calmly and directly. Maybe you choose to continue waiting until the other person de-escalates themselves. Either way, you are making the decision, not your emotions, not the aggressor's energy. In personal relationships, silence can also serve as a powerful mirror. When someone you care about lashes out in anger, your instinct may be to fix it immediately, to talk it out, to argue your case. But sometimes, the most loving and powerful thing you can do is to let your silence speak louder than your words. It communicates, I am not willing to have a conversation at this level of disrespect. It invites the other person to rise to a better version of themselves if they want to continue engaging with you. Of course, not all silences are created equal. The silence must be calm, not sullen or passive-aggressive. It must come from strength, not fear. You are not withdrawing because you are powerless. You are standing firm because you choose not to be pulled into a place you don't want to go. Your body language, your facial expression, your breathing, all these communicate your true state more than words ever could. When done correctly, your silence becomes a living boundary, one that says, this is not acceptable, without needing to raise your voice or engage in a verbal tug of war. In a world that values quickness and noise, mastering the discipline of silence is an advanced skill. It requires patience, self-respect, and a deep understanding of human psychology. But when you wield it wisely, silence doesn't just defend you, it transforms the entire conversation. It shifts the emotional landscape, it destabilizes aggression, and it places you firmly in control, not by overpowering others, but by mastering yourself. Silence, when intentional, is not the absence of action, it is the highest form of action. When faced with an aggressive person, one of the most powerful verbal strategies you can use is to ask calm, clarifying questions. This technique transforms the dynamic completely, shifting the interaction from confrontation to critical reflection. Aggressive individuals often act from a place of emotional reactivity rather than rational thought. They lash out because they are overwhelmed, frustrated, or seeking to dominate. By posing a thoughtful, non-defensive question in the middle of their aggression, you interrupt their emotional momentum and force them to engage their thinking brain. Instead of reacting emotionally, they have to slow down and consider your question, even if only for a moment. This disrupts their flow and often leads them to become less sure of themselves, which can be enough to de-escalate the situation. Asking clarifying questions also puts you in the leadership position during the interaction without escalating the aggression. You're not matching fire with fire, you're calmly inviting the other person to be specific, to explain themselves, to reflect. Questions like, can you help me understand what specifically is upsetting you? Or what outcome are you hoping for here? Challenge the aggressor to move from vague, emotional outbursts to concrete thinking. And often, aggressive individuals realize they don't have a clear point. Their anger is fueled by general dissatisfaction, miscommunication, or even unrelated personal issues. When you ask them to specify, it exposes the emotional fragility underneath the aggression. Moreover, calm questions demonstrate your emotional control. They show that you are not intimidated, you are not reactive, and you are not going to be dragged into chaos. You are standing firm in a rational space, inviting the other person to meet you there. And that act, even if subtle, asserts quiet authority. It also sets a standard. We will communicate like adults. We will have dialogue, not a shouting match. People may not always respond immediately to this shift, but internally they recognize it. It changes the tone and the expectations for how the conversation will continue. When asking clarifying questions, tone is everything. The questions must be asked with genuine curiosity, not sarcasm or passive aggression. A sharp tone can escalate things further, while a soft, steady tone communicates safety and seriousness. You are offering the aggressor a way to save face by engaging rationally instead of continuing to lose control emotionally. You are offering them dignity, which makes it easier for them to step back from aggression without feeling defeated or humiliated. Another powerful aspect of this strategy is that it buys you time. When you are confronted with unexpected aggression, it's easy to feel flustered or overwhelmed. Asking a calm question allows you to slow the tempo of the conversation, giving yourself a few precious seconds to gather your thoughts, regulate your emotions, and strategize your next move. It turns a reactive encounter into a proactive one where you regain some measure of control. In addition, asking clarifying questions opens up the possibility of productive dialogue. Not every aggressive person is purely destructive. Sometimes underneath the anger, there are legitimate concerns that have simply been expressed poorly. By steering the conversation toward clarity, you create space where real issues can be discussed and possibly resolved. Even if resolution isn't possible immediately, you have shown yourself to be a person of reason and respect, which strengthens your credibility in the long run. In conflict, many people believe that winning means overpowering the other person. But true strength lies in maintaining composure, guiding the emotional energy of the situation, and setting the stage for meaningful communication. Calm, clarifying questions are a subtle but powerful way to achieve that. They don't just neutralize aggression, they transform it. And in doing so, they reveal a deeper truth that leadership in conflict isn't about shouting louder, it's about thinking clearer, staying calmer, and leading others, even aggressive ones, toward a better way of being.